What's that in the sky? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No. It is Doug from Pine Creek's Flying Man. Welcome to Exploring Reality. Today we're taking on Doug from Pine Creek's Flying Man Thought Experiment. Stay tuned, enjoy the music, and we'll get started soon. All right, guys, welcome to Exploring Reality. You guys have seen Caleb before. Tim's been on here before in Philosopher's Garb. You're on TikTok and everything. So, Caleb, you're a friendly face. Everybody knows who you are on here. But why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll kind of go down the line. And then
Yeah, I don't know how you could forget my face, whether for good or bad reasons. But yeah, I'm Caleb. Been on Than's channel a lot. I might as well be the co-host at this point. Hint to him. But yeah, we've done a lot of presentations on this. I'm an author and just independent researcher who just does this as a hobby and thinks that subjects of theology and philosophy are really interesting. Right now, I'm working on a large book on miracles, and specialties are miracles, the resurrection, and partially theodicy. So glad to be here. And I kind of was the one who constructed this whole thing, got the idea for it. So I'm excited to see where this goes tonight. So thanks for having me on, Tham.
Yeah, thanks for doing this with us and leading the project. All right, in Philosopher's Garb, why don't you introduce yourself? You've never been on a channel before, so.
I've never been on the channel before. I got to know you and Caleb and some of the other guys here on YouTube not too long ago. They convinced me to make a TikTok, so I've started having a TikTok channel where I do apologetic responses. I've gone live with Than before. And yeah, I have a little bit of an academic background in some of these areas, but it's mainly just a hobby. And I was kind of a last minute addition to the stream today, and I'm happy to be here. I think it'll be fun.
Cool. Thanks, man. All right, Tim, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm another one of these autodidacts, Christian thinker. My specialties are in philosophy of religion, most centrally on the problem of evil, and then on the resurrection of Jesus as well. That's been a main focus of mine, in addition to gospel reliability. And then more recently, I've done a lot more work on the atonement and Christian eschatology as well.
Awesome. All right, Caleb, what are we doing today, man?
Yeah, so I think I had first come to you all asking, like, there's a big YouTuber, atheist YouTuber skeptic known as Pine Creek. Doug is his real name. Who, a lot of higher up people in the apologetics community don't really seem to take him seriously, but a lot of people do. I think we've all seen messages and comments of people who have been deconverted or at least been seriously troubled by him. And we'll get into the specifics of what that is, but he's kind of known for his cross-examinations and really grilling Christians. It's not just I make a video, respond to you. He really likes that impersonal interaction and his hypotheticals and his thought experiments. So he has one really well-known one called the Flying Man, and we'll be looking at that one. We'll be looking at subjunctive ones that relate to that in terms of his epistemology of miracles. But that's kind of where we're doing this. So this is really meant to be kind of a videographical manual, if you will, for at least how we see it, for going against Doug. And next time people call into a show, hopefully they will take this into account or watch this and maybe not be troubled by it, or at least have reconsiderations of the Flying Man. And so I think we tried to represent this as fairly as possible. A lot of people straw man this and stuff, but I tried my best to understand this and to fairly represent it. So we'll see how accurate that is. But yeah, with that, I think we can get into it. And so I think we had established the structure of this. I'm going to just, I did make the slide, so I'm going to just go, and anyone here who wants to add thoughts or other points, because some of you all have notes, that's fine. And just interrupt me when you want, and we'll do that when it's appropriate. So I think it'll be great, and I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say.
Awesome.
Yep. All right, let's go ahead and share this. Good thing we
once you put it up.
There's a video at the beginning. There's a video.
No, it's like the third or fourth slide. Share screen. Chrome. All right, there we go. Everyone see that? Yes.
No, we
Almost. We're getting there. Yeah, here we go.
Also, Caleb, if you want the chance to be somebody's favorite, I put. Oh, can you see this or no?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my thing.
Somebody says Wesley Bassiner says, if I get a shout out, Caleb Jackson will be updated to being my favorite Caleb again.
Wesley, I'm very excited that you said that and you left a comment. And yes, I appreciate your thing. So I'm glad I can be your favorite Caleb. I'm not even my favorite Caleb, to be honest, but out of the Calebs I know. But I appreciate your hierarchy of me in that sense. So I appreciate it. I don't usually condone idolatry. But,
oh, jeez. Okay, let's.
anyway, let's get into that. All right,
yeah.
we good to go? Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so I aptly named this the outsider test for Doug, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the outsider test for faith, which is what Doug uses. It's a term. I think it was coined by John Loftus, but he also incorporates this into street epistemology, which, as we know, was developed by Peter Boghossian and his book. I think or is it called Street Epistemology? Or
no, it's called The Manual for Creating Atheists.
Yes, thank you, Manual for Creating Atheists. Yes, thank you, Tim. And that's kind of
what Doug does not call himself a street epistemologist, and he rejects that label for himself.
That's true, but I think he does admit that he does have influence from Boghossian and
yes.
Him. So yeah, but thank you. That is a good point to point out. So yeah, YouTube's favorite Socratic skeptic, as I call it. He likes the Socratic method. He likes asking questions, as he would say, in all his different forms. He allegedly has a office for his organization up in Wichita, and he likes to give out Applebee's gift cards and Pine Points. So if we get lucky, maybe we'll get some of those. Yeah, Pine Points. I think we'll get 20,000 Pine Points just for this presentation. So I'm excited. So today we're going to basically be going over the Flying Man, and we're going to address his water-soaked napkin kind of thought experiment, or standard as well in this. So what is the Flying Man? Usually it's Myron is what he calls him. So Myron, the Flying Man. We have here a man jumping over the Grand Canyon. So in this next video, and let me know, Than, if the audio doesn't connect. If no one says anything, I'll assume it is. There's going to be a 3-minute video that I edited together of him kind of just explaining what the Flying Man is to get a good grasp of it in his own words. So let's see. Oh, sorry. It's next slide. Flying Man is thought experiment laid out by Doug. And basically it's meant to establish this outside test of faith that we said. And he's basically trying to show that the epistemic standards you use for Christianity are not applicable or are not applied consistently to other religions. It's not better attested in other religions. And if you had the same evidence for this claim as you did for Christianity, you would reject that claim but accept Christianity. And so you're being inconsistent, and you probably ultimately just believe based on emotional reasons or psychological reasons. I don't think he says that for everybody, but it does seem to be a kind of implicit theme underlying a lot of his streams. So with that, Flying Man.
One of my favorite thought experiments that I think Christians should, in the privacy of their own homes, ask themselves where they feel safe and secure is the Flying Man experiment. And my great grandfather could fly, literally unaided. He actually he ran off the cliff at the Grand Canyon here in Arizona, and he started flying. And then the Christians should ask themselves, okay, if you hear that coming out of my lips, do you believe it? And if you do, shame on you. Christian will say, well, I'll need some evidence. And then what I do is I layer on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus to the flying man, exactly, one by one. And if your needle changes, I'm very curious to see at what point it does change. So let's say this is, you're not confident it happened. Here, you're very confident it happened. I say, so right now I tell you about the flying man, you're not confident at it at all. Doug's just making up a story. No, I'm not. Christian's listening. I'm telling the truth. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather could actually fly unaided. But I agree with you. You shouldn't believe me yet. But wait till you hear my evidence. I have a guy who wrote something down about 20 years after my great-great-great-great-grandfather flew. And he said that the flying man appeared to 500 people and to 12 other people at the same time who witnessed this flying of my great-great-great-great-grandfather. Question for Christians, do you believe me now? Does that move the needle anywhere closer to believing, being confident that's true? And if your answer is yes, shame on you. You shouldn't believe me at this point based on a creed and a report of 500 people seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just keep on layering it on.
Usually if someone says, okay, Doug, this is a thought experiment, I get it, but it doesn't work because of X. This is the beauty of the thought experiment. I can change it to whatever you want it to be. Like what Testify said over here. Well, it's a trivial miracle just flying, like, oh, it has no significance. Well, okay, if that's why you think the thought experiment doesn't work, I can fix that. He flew for your sins. Now it works, yes? No, because you don't have this or that. Okay, but I can give you that. You want 2,000 years of history before it? You got it. But whatever you say, we can put in. But the main purpose of the flying man is to be laser focused on each piece of evidence and introduce them in chronological order and then see when your belief switch turns on.
Okay, so last thing I'll say on this, just to quote him from that, the main purpose of the flying man is to be laser focused on each piece of evidence and introduce them in chronological order and then see where your belief switch turns on. So I kind of just have that laid out here, but the Doug is focused on where the needle tips basically. And he said a couple things in there. He said that, and he also said that he can mimic it to whatever it needs to be. And so if you want to throw in relevant religious context, he can do it like that. So with that, I think I'll just lay out his strategy, and then we can go into some of your all's critiques of why you think this probably isn't necessarily adequate. But I think, as far as I understand,
make sure you go back to that slide after we get through these steps. Can you?
Yeah. Steps. Yeah, that's fine. I'll be real fast. So it's like the step one. It seems to be he sets up the parallels. He gives you the example. We have the creed. We have anonymous text written 40, 50 years later. Whatever you want that's parallel to the evidence for Christianity or Islam or whatever. Then we adjust the hypothetical. Okay, they'll say yes, but, and say, okay, fine, we'll introduce that. And so Doug calls this whack-a-mole. So he, because people will say, okay, but this, if you address that. And so he basically wants to get all of his bases covered. Once you make a perfect mirrored parallel, then he wants to see where the evidence converts from doubt to belief. So this is where he talks about the needle ticking in terms of, okay, now I don't believe, now I do believe. What part of that, what accumulation of evidence went from that to that, went from over 50%. And the last one is, once you say what that is, then you'll discuss the veracity of that. So if you say, okay, now I believe because the disciples were, let's say, willing to be martyred, then he would focus on that point and say, like, okay, what's the evidence they were martyred? Can someone be willing to be martyred and still be wrong? And he would go into all of that. So that's kind of what he's doing. He's really trying to hammer down exactly what piece of evidence gets you there. And so you can't just say the evidence for Christianity. And then he wants to focus on that and essentially show why he doesn't think that's adequate. So that's how I understand it in terms of how you would lay that out. But yeah, I can go back to, do you want this slide or the first one? Or this one? Sorry.
The one with his quote.
Okay.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
All right. So does anybody want to go first, or?
I have one short question. I mean, I'm not going to go into sort of the bulk of my critique here, but I have one short question. What do we mean by chronological order, Douglas?
That's where I was going to go with that.
Are we talking about introducing these pieces of evidence in terms of the most significant, or are we talking about start from the least significant and build up? And if it's just what's the best piece of evidence for your claim, it seems to me that this just becomes redundant and fairly uninteresting. Of like, okay, there's all kinds of people who ask, okay, what's the best evidence for your sort of thing? And if you talk about a cumulative case, then it's not necessarily the case that that you've got one big piece of evidence right here that's going to do a lot of the work. But one of the problems with starting with with regards to where you start is that Doug cares not about necessarily like how much credence you're giving each piece, but at what point does your thing turn out? He talks about this all the time. Like, at what point do you get over the hump at 50? So we could have a number of pieces of evidence. Let's say that one, and I'm saying about this very crudely, probabilistically here, but just sort of go with me. If we have one piece that gets you from, let's say you have a prior probability of like 10 to 1, and then one piece gets you to like, okay, fine, we're at 3 to 1 now. And the next piece gets you to, okay, we're like, this is a 45% chance this happened. And then the next one gets you, that's a little bit, so 47, and then 51. So instead oh my goodness, that's the one that got you from that got you from 47 to 51%. That's a big deal in Doug's mind. When in reality, that might not be the piece, or it could be the case that there's all of these pieces that you can't necessarily assign like very specific credences to each one, and it really is a sort of an accumulation of these different things. And when you focus in on one, you don't necessarily get the what Doug's looking for in terms of, oh my goodness, this is actually a really, really important piece, because there are all kinds of times when Christians have sort of fallen into this where they get to over 50% here, and Doug's like, well, is that the real reason you believe? That's the real reason? Well, it's one among many, but like, that just happens to be the one that gets them over the 50% when you start at a particular point, and with, depending on the chronology you take, right?
Can I just say in that he clarified in the chat, I think he means literally chronological in terms of earliest to latest.
I was just going to say, he just put that in the chat, so that's helpful.
Oh, good.
Because there's a few different ways you can interpret what chronological meant, so that helps.
Why he starts with the creed and then goes to the Gospels. Usually he doesn't start with the Gospels. So usually it's the Paul, and then we add the 500, and then we add parts of the creed, then we add the Gospels, then we add the persecution, then we add the success Christian, whatever you want. Typically it's in that order, but it's it's with the historical method specifically. It's not just with So I think he needs chronology of the historical documents. So
So I do want to say like one thing real quick, and I do think that this is like a valuable thing that he is doing, because it does force us to ask questions about the force of the data that we have in our cumulative case, and it makes us ask questions of ourselves as to like, at what point in our credence scale do we go from degrees of belief to like, I believe this and I affirm this proposition. Like, I think those are valuable things to clarify within our own epistemology and our methodology. So I just kind of want to put that out there. Like, I don't think that this is completely silly as a lot of people try to make it out to be.
Yes, and whatever your response is, Doug has probably thought of it himself.
Yeah,
Doug has already built this in. So like,
I know we're responding,
and like, if you're just going to sort of come in, Doug has already thought of that. It's like the people would say, "Oh yeah, I'll just grant that. I'll just say, yeah, we got the evidence. If you just have the evidence for Christianity, and we have that, then I'll just say, yeah, the flying man happened. Yeah, I mean that's true, but as we can point out." Doug already has this built in to his thing. This is sort of an evolving thought experiment. He's already built in a lot of these.
There's a dialogue tree.
And Philosopher's Garb. Go ahead. Yeah, philosopher. No, I'm going to call you IPG just for short. Did you have anything you wanted to add, or do you think we covered that in terms of what's been said so far?
I mean, the main thing that stuck out to me is the point that Tim made, where it's like, listen, if this is a cumulative case, if this is like, there's multiple pieces of data that are being put on the table, it may not be that the straw that breaks the camel's back is that particularly heavy, but that doesn't mean that, it's irrational for that to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So I think that's the main thing that struck out to me. I mean, sorry, go ahead, Tim. Did you have
no? Go. You finish what you're saying.
No, so I mean, that struck out to me. But then also, I mean, It's so, I mean, so Doug says like, okay, well, anything you say about, Christ or the Christian creed or whatever, I can kind of reformulate this thought experiment to, in a sense, I can bake it back in, right? Well, then it might get to a point where I'm like, okay, cool, you've perfectly kind of parodied the, Christian case. Well, then at that point, what if I'm like, yeah, cool, if that really did come about, if you really did present that to me, then that would be a challenge to my faith. I would have to rethink it. But in the absence of you bringing about this case, like in the absence of this case being actual,
well, it's a hypothetical, though.
I get it.
Yeah.
Right. So,
but I'm saying, let's say hypothetically, I said, yeah, sure. If this really did all come about, it would be problematic. I could say that. I could be like, all right, yeah, if all this came about, it would be problematic. I'd have to say it's just as probable.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but would it be? I think in this hypothetical, though, Christianity doesn't exist. It's like replacing.
Right.
This is an outsider.
This is a different world, and in this world, this basically is the equivalent of Christianity, but it's with the flying man. It has all the same evidence, and you would. So I guess you could just say you'd accept it, right? But then he would want to know, okay, but why are you accepting this, and not like what about this kind of evidence is persuasive to you? And that's what he wants to get to the needle in terms of the specificity. So, if you just say the evidence of Christianity, it's like, well, okay, what particular aspect of that is it, and then we can try to pick that apart.
But then I mean, I guess my thought then is like, if that's really what it's about, is picking a specific point of evidence that you think is what gets you over the hump, and then talking about how adequate is that as far as like evidence to get you over the hump. I guess maybe I'm questioning like how really useful is this thought experiment? Because then why don't we just do that? Why don't we just start there? Why don't we just talk about really how useful is it to talk about, an early creed or being preached in a?
Well, I think he's
trying to protect against the but that the Christians is going to do.
Yeah, and I think he wants to say that you wouldn't accept that standard of evidence in a different context. So you wouldn't accept someone talking 20 years later, reporting secondhand about something.
Yeah. But if you don't, because remember, we're not supposed to really care about the flying man. It's not something we're supposed to have any sort of emotional attachment to. And he thinks that the Christian has this emotional attachment to Jesus. Spoiler alert, kind of true.
I mean, look,
careful, Tim. You're gonna be a soundbite.
This might just completely invalidate this whole entire stream or anything I'm going to put into this, but I would be completely dishonest if I didn't say I don't have some sort of an emotional attachment to the way I view the world as a Christian, and so does that come into effect as to how I reason and everything like that? Like, again, it probably does. And I'm okay with admitting that, because at least we can look at this as best as we can with the data.
And then he would say, but can a Muslim and a Hindu also be emotionally connected and be wrong?
Yeah, and I'm not. So maybe this is where I differ from a lot of Christians, and I think this is again why I think I find a lot of value in what Doug is doing, because I think all of us would agree here that our claim on Christian theism is not 100% certainty. We allow for the possibility of us being wrong, at least to some degree. I don't know if you guys would disagree with me there, but I think it is possible to be wrong as a Christian.
Yeah. Yep. Can we say something? Yeah. Can I go back to the thought experiment? So one worry that I have here, that I've seen from Doug, I don't have like specific instances picked out. One could have gone into the sort of archives, because there are plenty. But one worry I have with the nature of how we're treating this as a cumulative case is that we focus. I think it's good to focus on piece by piece by piece. I think that's a really good way of going about things. But if one is going to make a move from this piece really helps to this is the piece that grounds my worldview. And I think Doug makes a shift from, hey, this Christian is saying that this is an important piece in getting you towards that, to, hey, so the real reason you believe is this piece right here. When in reality, that's not necessarily what the Christian is committing themselves to. It's just that, again, it just happens to be the case that in this sort of chronological order, and I mean, with regards to the evidential value of the chronological order, I mean, I understand why one goes about it, but it is kind of arbitrary in terms of what direction we go with the evidence. If you take away this piece, regardless of which direction you go, it's going to be kind of arbitrary in terms of which pieces you're looking at, and it just happens to be that one puts you over the 50% mark. And then you over focus on that and say, hey, the real reason you believe in that is this. And that if we didn't have this, you wouldn't believe it all. And
Yeah, he wants to. Sometimes he goes backwards. He'll say, "Okay, let's take
he does that
everything
too.
and then take away John. Okay, now take away Luke. Do you still believe?"
Yeah.
And he wants to see. And so once you say, "Okay," after like if you get rid of Luke, okay, now I wouldn't. Then you say, "Okay, now what about Luke?" Because then he'll say, "Well, Luke,
right.
Luke
He wants to
doesn't
hyper focus in, which
Yes.
I think is valuable, but it is going to end up being arbitrary, which is why I don't like this thing of when you get over the 50% mark, that's what is really, really important here. And it seems to me that is going to put the Christian into a position of having to defend things that they're not necessarily trying to defend with regards to the strength of each individual piece of evidence.
And so I guess another thing, though, I would ask Tim, or I would ask him, but I think you mentioned this before, Tim, is that I would ask, I understand cumulatively it is, but for Doug, does the accumulation of this move the needle at, like, if we had for the Flying Man, the Creed, and all these like later texts, do those later texts move the needle at all, or is he saying that even if we have all this accumulation, that either doesn't move it or moves it so little that it's irrelevant? That's
Right.
fine.
If you go back in the video, there's a point where I'm doing this sort of thing, and it's where he's sort of shifted from, hey, do you believe that because of that, versus, hey, does this move the needle at all, basically? And he does sort of equivocate there, at least in that clip.
And what you could do is you could pile, like, I would like, okay, let's say we had one witness to this. Would it do it? No. Okay, two. And let's keep piling on. Let's see where, okay, now I would, okay, how many witnesses? 15? Like, and that's something I would say. But, or is that not move at all? Does 15 witnesses versus 7 witnesses versus 3 witnesses not have any needle whatsoever? Because I feel like at that point, that would be probably.
And you can't just, this is another thing that I've seen Doug, do, and people like Doug who have sort of tried to mimic this, is that you are trying to undercut the evidential strength of testimony by appealing to the prior probability. And that just doesn't work. You could have a very low prior probability, but that doesn't affect the likelihood ratio of the strength of the evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, and we'll get into the testimony in a second.
That doesn't affect the likelihood ratio of the strength of the testimony whatsoever. The testimonial evidence sort of speaks for itself. It's when you're weighing what is the probability of this on the hypothesis versus without this hypothesis, how likely is this data? And I think that's where Caleb, I, and Thad, probably all of us, are going to say that we've got some pretty fundamental disagreements with Doug over the strength of testimonial evidence. And you can't undercut that with a Humean argument because the prior is not relevant to that.
Yeah, and we'll get into that.
Right. But then this is where just like, I think this is where Pine Creek would say something like the Christian should remain consistent. He just actually said that now.
Wow, you can't act like that's an original thought, man.
Wow, is that an undesigned coincidence?
Yeah.
Right. No, I actually just read that. So Pine Creek is even here saying this is where the Christian should remain consistent. And I think this is, I would agree with him. The Christian should remain consistent. I think we're all in agreement there.
Yeah. And that's why I'd be fine with saying that, okay, you're coming up with some evidence here for the Flying Man. And I would agree with the sort of strength of that evidence in that case. And he might disagree. He might have a disagreement there, but that gets us beyond the Flying Man thought experiment, gets us into sort of other issues. Yeah. And then the utility of the thought experiment has sort of run its course, and we can move on to the epistemology of testimony.
So we set up two different things here, and we're kind of getting into weeds. So let's try to get back on track, probably. I'm assuming, Caleb, you wanted to?
Yeah, well, no, one thing before we move on to the testimony part, I was just going to ask if any of you wanted to, because I know we wanted to cover this. So when it comes to the theological significance of Christianity, now I know we're going to say the death and resurrection is important, and what Pine Creek would say is that's basically, I don't think he says it, he'll say that's essentially arbitrary, and I can just say flying for your sins is important. So the idea that you have to have a blood sacrifice for sin is just a Christian presupposition, and why can't we say you can just fly for sin? So do you all think that there is a metaphysical a priori reason independent of Christian theology for thinking that of this atonement in death instead of flying, and without having to appeal to Christian presuppositions, essentially?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that you can go ahead, Dan. You first.
No, please go ahead, Tim. I'm monitoring the chat at the same time because it's a little bit busy right now.
All right. But yeah, I do think that I think that from perfect being theism, in our response to the problem of evil, you can derive something like the incarnation and atonement, if the atonement properly conceived as sort of this defeat of death. in relation to the problem of evil, and in a way that he's trying to do some things where he just sort of inserted in, hey, but the flying man died for your sins.
Flew for your sins.
Flew for your sins. But I just don't think that there's these organic connections, and you can try to make them. And if you really create enough, you can perhaps he can try to make these organic connections in the same way that death and resurrection have. To respond to the problem of evil. If I know Caleb has tried to do this, and I just wasn't, particularly convinced that you've made the parallel. But let's say, okay, fine, you can, if you think long and hard enough, you can sort of make flying the same thing as death, essentially. But then you've just made flying the same thing as death, and you're making our point for us, basically.
Well, so
if there is this actual organic connection, then you've just called death and flying the same thing, essentially, right?
Because he could parody it and say, okay, and when God first created, everything was perfect, everyone could fly and be with God, but there was a literal fall, like falling, and people can no longer fly, and so by the flying man flying, this basically makes this change of that. But what you could say, so I guess what you're saying is that the real thing being defeated, it doesn't really matter. It's basically separation from God, and it doesn't really matter if that's literally flying or death. In the world,
no. I don't think that's the case. No,
okay,
I think that it's deeper than that because of the nature of horrendous evil, and where the nature of death is like intrinsically sort of devoid of meaning making, and I think that's why death is a horrendous evil. And I think if you ask 100 people, I bet most people would say that death is a horrendous evil.
Death is a common punishment, right? I don't know of anywhere in the world where they're like, all right, you committed this crime, we're gonna put you in an airplane and we're gonna fly you somewhere or something.
Maybe off a cliff. You could be flown off a cliff.
But that's not flying, right? So I think like Tim was saying, like if we come to the aspect of the atonement with the idea of penal substitution, which I don't know where you guys land on that, but I think that's a central aspect of it. Well, then I have this defense, you know, Tim. Well, I mean, if you come to the atonement thinking an aspect of it is Christ is in a sense bearing our punishment, and it's through bearing that punishment that he saves us. Well, then I don't think it makes sense to say the flying man flew for our sins in the same sense that Jesus died.
I do agree with you there that I don't think that I think that it would be hard. It's hard to sort of parody penal substitution. But for any atonement theory, I don't think that. I mean, we're going to get into this in another stream because we're actually going to talk about Doug and the atonement. But I don't think that he is. And I really want to be fair to Doug here. But I don't know how much nuance Doug speaks about the atonement with it. And I know it's not because I don't think he's trying to straw man or anything. But I don't think that. I don't think that he is sort of represented in full what I would consider to be the Christian claims of the incarnation and atonement, and how they organically connect to this to perfect being theism and the response to the problem of evil and things like that. That where one can derive essentially something like a physical resurrection from God incarnate because of the intrinsic nature of defeat that is required of a perfect God in order to.
If flying is the defeat condition in this hypothetical world, if flying could fulfill all of those, then you'd be perfect.
Sure, but we've tried, but I don't see how flying is sort of organically connected to.
Well, he'll say he doesn't see how death is, but I understand your point. But I guess we're just saying if it fulfills the defeat condition, and we can just assume.
This is where I guess couldn't Doug just feasibly say the dying, like the flying to the dying man? Couldn't Doug just feasibly say
dying man? Oh no, not the dying man.
Into the dying man and atoned for our sins, and then flew out of the Grand Canyon? Like, because then death is incorporated.
If you've got that, then I mean, yeah, you've made significant progress. If this is really it's just death, and you've got same more with horrendous evils. But again, this is about the nature of defeat, and I don't see how this flying versus not flying. I don't see how not flying is like this horrendous evil, which requires defeat. Which again, the nature of defeat is to integrate the composite whole of a person with that evil in place, and with that evil in place, is also just making it altogether greater whole in the Adamsian and the Chisholmian notion of defeat there, and where with regards to the physical resurrection, the only way to defeat death is essentially to incorporate, is to vindicate the human person, and that sort of goes back into Irenaeus and the recapitulation sort of a motif of the atonement, where you get the perfect God essentially recapitulating in himself the human nature and restoring it. And a physical resurrection is important here because it is the value of this person, which is an embodied moral agent. That's very important. So that just sort of defeating death in a very narrow sense in terms of putting them in a sort of Platonic afterlife, I don't think that does the trick at all. So I do think it requires a physical resurrection in order to defeat this horrendous evil of death.
Yeah, and of course, flying is
what would
arbitrary.
be
Though we don't have
helpful-
to say it doesn't have to be flying. It can be resurrection. It can be.
Right. And then you're talking. Then we've made the accurate parallel, and then we can talk about the value of that.
The only
Right.
difference is it's not Jesus. Yeah, that's.
I think it's gonna. I think what's gonna be important here is there might be some people that don't understand the significance of why we're contesting this point, right? Because this does affect the priors, and so.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Right. So Tim, go ahead, please.
I was going to actually make another sort of preemptive response to Doug here. And so Caleb was trying to help me with his last night, just reminding me of sort of things that Doug would say here and say, we would appeal to some of this stuff that we're, again, talking about to bulk up the priors for Jesus and sort of, narrow down the reference class that Jesus is in. And he would say, okay, could let's say we're appealing to the aesthetic and moral character of Jesus' teachings. He could say, but could Jesus still be God? Could Jesus not be God and he still be the perfect ethical teacher? I think that sort of possibility misses the point in that what we're trying to do is we're trying to narrow down the reference class. And if it is indeed the case that this flying man guy has these profound moral teachings, then of course, that narrows down the reference class that God would perform a super miracle on this person. And I think that's why that in my model, at least, of the way we're sort of narrowing down the priors, Jesus isn't the only person who has who is in at least somewhat of a reference class for God to perform a super miracle on them. I think that Jesus, by in a way, is the best sort of fit here. But I think that there are ways to sort of say that, hey, this person is in a little bit of a more narrow reference class. Like, would I be more surprised if Jesus performed a miracle? It said that if God performed a miracle on Mother Teresa, or just pick some good. I know Mother Teresa, you don't know if she's actually good or not, but like
Christian Richards wouldn't say so.
Pick some good, some really, profound, like Martin Luther King. I don't know, whoever you like.
Dolly Parton.
Dolly Parton.
Dolly Parton. There we go. Or someone like that, or just some random some random guy or something, or Hitler or something. Would a perfect being is a perfect being more likely to perform a miracle on Hitler or Mother Teresa? I think that you're getting closer to what the Christian is trying to at least start to do with regards to Jesus.
True. Although, Tim, I think what he would say, this will be the last thing we can do, and then we'll move on to the other stuff. To know we don't want to go too far over an hour, but I think what he would say is that, like, historically, we can't really know, or it'd be almost impossible to know if someone was truly good, because he would say, well, we have Ravi Zacharias. Everyone thought he was great, and behind the scenes, there was some stuff. We don't know that Paul wasn't sleeping with prostitutes secretly. We don't know that Jesus wasn't doing stuff behind the curtain that was never reported. So he would basically say we can't establish that reference class historically because we simply can't rule that out.
Not with certainty, not with certainty, but I think that the consistency and I think that Jesus is, I really think that speaks for itself, and we can, get into the details there, but it's a little bit, incommensurable, in terms of how we view it. And it's not just the ethical teachings, but it's the sort of the whole, whole broader context of all these things that I know it's but, I agree.
All right. Are we good to move on to the part about testimony? Awesome. All right. So now we get into the what kind of testimony. We talked about the priors in terms of the categories and that. So, but what about the kind of actual historical testimony evidence we would need to establish something like a flying man or rising from the dead or any kind of thing? Well, here's things that we would be looking for. So you want a plurality of witnesses, preferably independent of each other, neutral witnesses or hostile witnesses or third parties. So you don't just want fervent believers. It'd be nice if we had people who are skeptics or at least didn't care either way who saw this. If we only had disciples of the flying man doing this, That would kind of be a question mark. Witnesses have established credibility. They're not overly credulous. They are otherwise trustworthy. Miracle isn't obviously self-serving for monetary gain, fame, money, or power. Now, Doug has implied before that he thinks Paul might have been lying for money. At least he's open to the idea. And so a lot of these would depend on what evidence you're defending, because Doug would not grant a lot of these for the Gospels or for the New Testament, but it would depend on what kind of case you want to make, if it's maximal or minimal or so ever. It's recorded soon after the event. So if something is reported third or fourth hand, decades later or centuries later, that's probably not the best kind of evidence. We want local in both location transmission. So again, close up to the eyewitnesses as possible. It didn't occur so fast that the details could be misremembered. So if it happened quickly, we know that memory can be faulty with car accidents if it happens really fast, or a bank robbery or something. But if it's something like, I spent 40 days with my best friend and we had lunch and he had been dead 3 days before, it's hard to misremember that, honestly, like maybe small details. But so it would depend on what exact kind of event it is. Some events we can misremember, and some events it would be very implausible to say, yeah, you just completely misremembered the entire thing. Misidentification could not have occurred. So we don't want this to be with strangers, people who didn't know what the person looks like, because we know that's going to be good for false memory. Someone that like, again, a teacher you spent 3 weeks.
This is a laundry list.
It is. It's good, though. Relevant religious context, we already established that, because if it's a secular extraordinary event, then it would be an anomaly. It would be weird, but it wouldn't be a miracle. If we're saying God specifically did this, or likely did this, then we would need to establish, motivations and in that kind of context. And last one, I would say that the miracle really can't be properly replicated in a secular context. So if a magician can do it identically or virtually identically under similar conditions, probably not a miracle. If it's easily replicable, so if someone gets healed and we have equivalent healings in natural context, probably not a good miracle. So those are the generalities of that.
Can I add something to that? Can I add something to our laundry list of things we sure would like? If it's being preached or proclaimed under severe threat, so under severe hostility, right? So this is something that comes up a lot when we talk about the proclamation of the resurrection, or just the entire faith of Christianity, is it's done in an incredibly hostile context. That's just another data point to put on that. I didn't think that fell in under anything under the list, and I think it's worth adding.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that's like has to, in terms of we should never believe a miracle unless the person is willing to deny. But that is certainly a good point. That helps. It does raise the probability for sure.
There are some other things I would add in there to the Christian
what?
case. But Tim.
Wait.
Go ahead. I'm curious.
I'm just saying, for the record, I don't need half of that stuff. I don't need it.
But it doesn't hurt.
I mean, no, it certainly helps. I mean, all that's great. But like, all I want is something that overcomes the prior probability. So it's going to be anything that has a likelihood, it has a strong enough likelihood ratio. This data just has to have a strong enough likelihood ratio, so that it overcomes whatever I think that the prior is. So all I got to have is, more than just enough. But
but I'm saying if we had the really low prior, if we had all of this kind of testimonial evidence and that.
I agree, that would really help. But I don't think we need to fulfill the laundry list necessarily. I think that, again, we just need to have on this be relatively unsurprising on the hypothesis that this miracle occurred, and without the miracle hypothesis, these things just be very unexpected. So that the vast majority of the probability space is going to be where nothing sort of happens.
Sure.
And there's no miracle that takes place on the hypothesis. So I think that if it's just very surprising without the miracle hypothesis, then that's really good evidence that it took place. And if you've sold me on that, this isn't that this person is in a different reference class, then we're really talking. I agree that those are good criteria to sort of at least practically and pragmatically narrow down the types of claims we're going to be taking more seriously initially. So I think I strongly agree with that, especially when we're doing something like with what Caleb is doing, where he's looking at a lot of these cases. And I think that that's where these criteria become so helpful, is that pragmatically, which ones are we going to look at more? And I think that that's why Caleb has focused so heavily on doing those sorts of criteria, and he did a really good job with that.
Yeah, and they're religiously neutral too. There's nothing wrong with establishing the priors, but I'm just saying these are basic principles of
Well,
testimony.
this goes beyond miracles, but there's other ways for the prior to be really low, other
Absolutely,
than
yeah. And this isn't, yeah, you're right. It's not just miracles. If there were eyewitnesses in a court of law to a car accident and they didn't know the guy and it happened fast, that could also disqualify, even if it's not a miracle.
Yeah,
So that doesn't have even a low prior. Like car accident's not that unlikely, but so yeah.
Well, there could be aspects that could make it a low prior, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. But that's pretty much all we established. So I was going to move on and show how these apply. If anyone else had anything to add before we did that, we're good. Great. So here's just kind of an example of how we'd apply. They have two different ones. So one of them is going to fulfill, one of them's not. So first one is our first example of a fly, and I just picked flying for the sake of argument to parody the flying man here. Daniel Douglas Holmes. So he was a psychic medium in the 19th century who allegedly could fly in front of people. There's one time where three witnesses said that they witnessed him flying over a balcony and landing onto another one. I think it was a distance of probably like 15, 20 feet apart from the buildings. So, if you just read that in a text and that's all the information you had, that might sound impressive. But if we look at the details, we might not be so confident. So here I have these criteria and I say whether it fulfills it. So plurality of witnesses, well, we have three, but they weren't really independent. We don't have anyone that wasn't already like interested in him. We don't have any like one who is a skeptic who saw this, to my knowledge, at least. Witnesses have established credibility. Not really. They were kind of accused of being credulous and didn't have a good track record. He did accept money and fame and got a lot of publicity for these. So I don't think I think that's a kill. It was recruited soon after the event, so that's good. Location transmission's fine. We do have three. We do have eyewitnesses. I think the fact that it occurred in dark lighting, it happened really quickly in just a few seconds, jump over that. That's going to be bad for memory in terms of accuracy, in terms of that. So misidentification is fine. Relevant religious context. Well, he did claim to have extraordinary abilities, but it's not clear as to why he would have this over others. Not clear what the message was. And this miracle can, in fact, be replicated. Again, a lot of people think he was jumping. The distance wasn't that much. And he other times he would levitate just a few inches for a few seconds. And this is a trick magician. So you've probably seen David Blaine and other people do it, where they just face backwards and you see them levitate a few inches. And this is just done with the heel lifting up. So it's like, ultimately, I think this gets at best a 3 out of 10, which isn't that good of a confidence level. So we would have good reason to doubt this claim. But let's look at another flying man, Saint Joseph of Cupertino. He was a 17th century Italian friar who could allegedly levitate. We have over 100 accounts of him levitating. I don't just mean like one book that says this. We have like first person saying, I saw Joseph fly, that we're collecting all this stuff. The church relocated him so many times because these were distracting to people. And the cool thing is that we have testimony from at least seven different cities because he was moved around so much. So people clearly independently of each other saying they saw these things. And sometimes these levitations did happen quickly or a few inches. So we can maybe say, okay, that could be false memory. But there were times where people would say he would be lifted up, 30 feet in the air and hang there unaided for 20 minutes in a trance and then fall down. That's not really something you could easily misremember or something like that. That would be something you probably would just have to be intentionally lying, or if some really, really elaborate magic trick is going on. And he would do this repeatedly. So we apply our criteria here. It actually fulfills all of them. The only one I'm not sure is the relevant religious context. Now, Joseph did usually do this in a religious context with the Virgin Mary. Whenever he would hear church music or see a statue or a painting, he would get into this trance and then start flying. But he would also do this with the sound of music. And sometimes while he was even, on one occasion, he was getting legged on a surgery on his leg, and he fell into a trance and lifted probably about a few inches off of his chair for about 8 minutes. And the doctor was filming around that. But, so there wasn't always religious context. So that's kind of a weird thing. But
you don't necessarily have to have religious context. You've just described like a narrative context in which it sort of makes sense.
Yes.
Beyond just it doesn't necessarily have to be religious context. It just has to be a narrative context in which an agent we would expect to act in a way that would.
That's true. And he did convert non-believers through these acts.
Yeah, that's important too.
So yeah, I think that it's not just random. Sometimes it's strange, but it certainly has that. In fact, what's interesting is Gottfried Leibniz, who most people know for the contingency argument, had I believe it was his mentor, his friend, who I think he was German, right? Who visited Cupertino, and we have him writing that his friend met Joseph and converted to Catholicism. And Leibniz doesn't explain why he converted, but if we look at the transcripts from the trial for Joseph, it talked about how this duke saw Joseph levitate in the air because of the Eucharist, and this actually got him to convert. And so that's the more detailed story. But the fact that we have
essentially neutral party attestation. This is really interesting, I think. Okay, so this is just quotes. I'm not going to read these all out, but people can see. So these are just quotes from historians like who think that this is really weird and who do take some of Joseph's flight seriously, even if they don't have an explanation. That's Carlos Ayer, who's a Yale professor of history and religious studies. Dale Allison, of course, famous New Testament scholar, basically says that, yeah, all the arguments presented for this being just acrobatics or something elaborate are really, really bad. And maybe this was some weird human ability. We don't know, which is a weird thing to say. But I mean, he doesn't really deny that people really thought they saw Joseph fly. So I just thought it was helpful. So in conclusion with the flying man, and someone can add stuff to this that they want, but I would say if Myron claimed to be some kind of prophet of God or some kind of son of God, something with that association, and we had several witnesses, preferably independent, who claimed to see Myron levitate over the Grand Canyon, maybe in different locations independently of each other, and this included hostile or disinterested witnesses who were antagonistic and skeptical of Myron, and this event occurred in broad daylight over an extended period of time, perhaps even repeatedly. This happened on multiple occasions, and both Myron and these witnesses had previously established credibility, and they were willing to suffer and endure persecution for the claims that Myron really did fly, then yeah, I would probably believe Myron flew based on that kind of historical testimonial evidence. And I know Doug might not grant all of those in terms of who wrote the Gospels and how many witnesses we have, but just throwing a hypothetical out there, that's what it would
right.
take.
So that last line I think is really important, because you just said Doug would not grant some of those lines of evidence, at least when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. But at that point, we're not doing a flying man anymore. We're doing a case for the resurrection, right. And at that point, we're not, like I said, well, I guess I already said it, right? Like, we're not doing the flying man anymore.
Yeah,
this is where we start talking about the data, and the flying man has served its point. There's no inconsistency here, or at least our evidential standard has been set up, and then we can right.
And then this is where Doug is going to offer more, I want to say, classic objections here, or more, there's nothing new or unique here. There's nothing substantively different here at this point. And then we're just talking about, okay, garden variety evidence for the resurrection or not, and then we can, do that. But yeah, and I would just say with regard to that answer to the flying man, I think I'd probably need a bit more with regards to the priors there, other than just claiming that the person's a prophet. I think I need more with the priors if I was going to go there. And again, it's hard to replicate some of these things because they're so narratively driven. That it's not easy to just just like copy paste this from one story to the other. You have to sort of make this whole story. So yeah, I think that it would help though. All of that would help me believe that the flying man flew.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that, Tim.
What do you think, James?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think I agree with the idea expressed in this slide, which is something I kind of touched on earlier. Like, if all the evidence, like this kind of laundry list of things that we think we have with Jesus, if that really was applicable to the flying man, I feel pretty fine, like, saying, okay, yeah, I would probably say that guy actually flew, and then we could talk about, did he fly because it was the power of God, or some other reason or whatever. Right. But I would be like, yeah, I would be fine saying that. So, and there was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I thought you were done.
Well,
keep going.
I was gonna say, I mean, like, in the beginning of at the beginning of kind of the video we showed of Pine Creek, there was this idea where he was like, okay, well, if I told you I had these witnesses and I've had this and that, and he starts parodying the evidence put forth for Christianity, and I ask you, would it move the needle? And then he says, if you say yes, shame on you. Well, like, this is kind of like, it's this biased kind of idea of like, if you find this type of criteria convincing, then you're kind of engaging in some type of epistemic failure. And when I look at, like, so for instance, what's on the slide right now, I don't think it would be some type of like epistemic downfalling on my part if I looked at this scenario, if it was actually as it is on the screen, and I said, yeah, I think that happened. I don't see why that would make me irrational. And I think it's at that point, Pine Creek would really need to present a good argument for why I would be irrational in believing the flying man here.
Yeah,
that's great. All the time.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we can't just say, like, I wouldn't believe it, oh, I would, like, intuitively. We have to give reasons why we wouldn't, right? We can't just say, well, I don't find that convincing or not. Like, epistemology does have subjectivity to it, but there needs to be objective things. So if you're going to say yes, it would be probabilistic. It would be wrong mathematically to say, if all I had was my ancestor flew, would you believe it? And I said yes. The chances of me lying to you or being mistaken are way higher than my ancestor flying, just with that alone. But if we had all of the stuff that we just mentioned,
that ticks up and up and up until the point where we're saying this kind of testimony, it would be more unlikely for all of this testimony together cumulatively to be wrong than it would be for the person to fly at the aid of God or some supernatural agent. So we're overcoming that low prior by saying it is even more unlikely that all of this would happen and they would still be wrong or lying than it would be that he did fly. So the priors are switched up at that point. So that is my claim. And we could talk about that. We have to put numbers on this, though. We can't just say, well, I wouldn't believe you with that, and just say that without giving a reason for it. We can't just say what's initially more likely. I agree it's initially more likely, but when we add all that together, I don't know if we know. I can't think of any example of evidence that fulfills all of that criteria that we don't trust, that we have like actual examples of. Like other examples of testimony that we don't trust usually doesn't fulfill all of those. It's the person's not credible, they're credulous, they happen fast, whatever you want to do. But I think that if this was any other event, it would be all that together would probably be accepted in a court of law. It just depends on whether the supernatural aspects are there or not. So,
but another thing again to keep in mind here, and I'm just sort of again just knowing this again for everyone's sake, you can't undercut the strength of the evidence by appealing to low priors. The strength of the evidence could still be really strong. Like the evidence for the resurrection could be really good, but the priors are just so low that the probability that Jesus rose from the dead still just remains so super low. Like you could still say that the evidence was really good. You could say that the evidence for the flying man was really good, even though you think that the priors for some reason are like just dismal.
Yep. All right. So last thing, this is going to be shorter because I know we're starting to go, is I said inflamed water soaked napkins, right? So what Doug is, I brought illustrations, props. So what Doug is, and he's basically trying to parody 1 Kings 18 here to his admission, is he would take a napkin, soak it in water, and pray in the name of Jesus, this would light on fire, and ipso facto, it would set on fire.
I think it's inflamed. I think you're supposed to put inflamed, not inflamed.
Oh, well, too late now.
It means like swollen and.
No, but I don't think the inflamed is correct.
Okay, well, we can put aside the grammar lessons.
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know.
Okay, fine.
I think I just Googled it and there's like controversy there, so I'm just gonna.
Okay, whatever. Yeah. Anyway, the point is, Doug is essentially that's his standard. Now he has given other examples, like raising a dead person, healing an amputee, stuff like that. So I think what we're getting at is what kind of standards are we saying? Like he will say nothing written on paper, which I think, as we discussed, isn't a really good standard because we could theoretically have testimony written down that would fulfill all of that, but. I think what he is implying in this, from what I can tell, is that he wants a miracle that's usually pre-announced. He wants one that's extraordinary and that's not so nothing mundane. I praise by my car keys. He wants it that's repeatable. So this happens and it can be done on command. And he wants it where it's verifiable and controls under controlled conditions. So if it happened the first time, maybe I switched out the lighter fluid with water. I switched out the water with lighter fluid. But if it happens multiple times under controlled conditions, okay, now I would be more skeptical. So those seem to be his standards. And I don't think that those are inherently wrong. Like if something did fulfill all those, that would be great and we should believe it. But I don't think that's necessary to believe. It's sufficient, but there are lower things than that. So I would say that depending on what the miracle is, with a lot of healing miracles at least, you do have this sense of control and the sense of replicability. I don't mean that we can pray and always observe them being healed, but we can repeat the diagnosis and we can repeat the healing. So if someone had, let's say, macular degeneration, juvenile macular degeneration, and we do have such accounts, where they were verifiably blind, and we do tests every 10 years, and we confirm, yep, still blind. We've repeated this under controlled conditions. We established that. Then they're prayed for. They say they can instantly see. They go back to the doctor. Okay, now their vision is 20/20, and we can establish that. We go back to the doctor 5 years after that, still healed, still good. We did that under controlled conditions and repeated that. So although the event itself, the prayer did not happen under controlled conditions, the facts that we need to establish are that they did have juvenile macular degeneration, which we can establish, and we can establish that they no longer do and they can see. So those are the two facts that need to be explained. The prayer is an incidental thing that comes in the middle, but we can at least establish through the scientific method, through normal testimony, those two facts, and then explain what was the transition? Why was it that him being able to see succeeded the macular degeneration and did not precede it? That would be what needs to be explained. So I would argue that would be sufficient because you would still have controls there to filter out possible mistakes in most cases. And that would still be biologically impossible because it's a genetic disease, assuming the diagnosis was correct and so forth. And so just the last thing I'll say on that is I do think that there are they're not that common, some miracles that would be equivalent, that would meet that criteria. For example, Betty Baxter, who I have pictured in the bottom left corner, was a young girl who had congenital scoliosis where her spine was extremely twisted. She was bedbound most of her life, and when she would sit in chairs, her upper body would basically just slouch where her head was in her lap. She couldn't sit up straight. And this was verified by doctors and all that stuff. And so she has a vision where Jesus tells her that she's going to be healed and tells her the exact date. I don't remember what it was like. Let's say it's March 23rd, 1941. I don't remember the exact date, but something like that. And so she says, oh, Jesus told me it's going to be healed on this date. They go and call the neighbors. And when this date comes, her mom buys her a new dress and new shoes, which obviously she has never, she hadn't worn shoes in years. And the neighbors get there and they start praying. We have probably 8 to 12 different neighbors here praying for her for about 10 minutes. And as she's praying, she sees Jesus appear to her, rub his hand on her back, and they hear popping sounds of bones going into place. She stands up, runs around. Everyone sees this. She goes in public. A few hours later, everyone sees her walking around perfectly normal. We have contemporary newspaper accounts of this, journalists who interviewed these witnesses, interviewed to a doctor, verified all of that. And so here we have one that was pre-announced to the exact date, was documented by physicians and journalists. So there's your controlled conditions, essentially, and would essentially be medically impossible if it happened instantaneously and spontaneously. So I would argue that's one. The other one, I won't go into too much detail here because there's a lot, would be the Zaytun Marian apparitions, which one picture is down here, where allegedly the Virgin Mary appeared in Egypt in 1967 to 1971. And there's other accounts after that. But this happened, this was pre-announced back in the 1920s when the person who built the church was told there was going to be a miracle there. But this light that was identified as the Virgin Mary appeared on probably dozens, if not hundreds of occasions between a 3 or 4 year period. And people would routinely gather there at night and see this light appear. They shut down all the power in the city and the light was still there. So there's your controlled conditions. People were healed and these were examined by a medical team, and some of these were medically inexplicable. So there's additional things of this. And there's been no good explanation for what caused this light. Some people say earthquake lights, but that's been criticized for various reasons. So we essentially have here an unexplained phenomenon occurring in a religious context that was pre-announced, that happened repeatedly under controlled conditions that we currently don't have an explanation for. So although I don't know if that would convince certain people, I do think that that does check off a lot of the boxes. Last thing I'll say is that Doug has also given examples of his sister, who is now deceased, who had severe multiple sclerosis and was paralyzed, and he knows she was paralyzed. He had prayed and she had been healed instantly, that might have tilted his thing. We do have at least 2 examples of that, one of which Than has talked about on his channel, Barbara Snyder. And we have lots of medical documentation where we can confirm her illness and her healing. And I would say Marian Carroll would be a second one in a Catholic context. We do have testimonial accounts, and I don't just mean 1 or 2 people. I mean like dozens of witnesses to amputees being healed. Than and I did a whole stream on that if you want to go check that out, from all the testimony evidence of that. And I have done 1 or 2 about people being raised from the dead. I don't just mean they were dead for 20 minutes and were revived. I mean someone who was killed, partially embalmed, had rigor mortis, was about to be buried, and was raised on camera over the period of a few hours in front of hundreds of witnesses in a religious context. And I talked with Matt Dillahunty about that in our debate, and he made a response video. So go check that out if you want. But that's pretty much all I had to wrap up. So last thing I'll say in the conclusion, then people can join in. Well, they want, Doug approvingly here with his thumbs up, is I would say Doug's specific standards for affirming any particular miracle claim are ill-defined and not clearly established. The flying man and other thought experiments do not take into relevant features of credible miracle testimony. And there are examples, I would argue, of supernatural claims, including flying, among other things, that I would say fit the criteria, which Doug doesn't seem to still accept. So with that, I would conclude the presentation. But if anyone else wants to comment, feel free. I think we pretty much wrapped that up.
Dan, James, you got anything?
Not really. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you go back to the slide where you have those 4 criteria?
Yeah. Oh, did I stop share? Okay, hold on.
Yeah, you did.
Stop sharing. I can just read them off.
So,
that would be easy.
No, I get it. I got to see.
While you're doing
I'm
that,
sorry.
and we don't have to go into it yet if we didn't do it, but did we cover like the whole question of like when does the needle move, or like what, like, or at what point of the needle?
Yeah, I think I pretty went into.
Okay, because I think that's a really important thing, and I just wanted to make sure we covered it. And I'm having some brain fog at the moment, so
yeah.
Okay, here you go, Tim. Here's your slides.
But yeah, I think that we did. I explained why I think that is sort of a problematic way, just dialectically, to carry on the conversation and actually get out what Doug is trying to get at. And why you can't make.
Oh, Tim froze.
Oh no.
In the name of Jesus, unfreeze.
This is evidence for Satan.
Problem of evil right here.
Yeah.
Paralyzed.
Why would a good God allow this?
Okay, well, we could just close out. I don't know if we have anything else to add or close if Tim isn't coming back anyway. At least it was towards the end. Unless he joins
Let me
back
see
in.
what happens if I just take him in and out.
Okay, so why we do it live?
Nope, that made it worse.
Oh. Well,
okay. Do you know what he was going to say?
I think he was just going to comment on those not necessarily being, and I agree that they're not necessary. I was just trying to kind of break down from the examples he's given in terms of what exactly criteria, because just giving like a hyper-specific example isn't helpful unless we establish why that's a better example, right? Like with the amputee thing, it's not, it has to be, the reason that people say that over like cancer is because what they're not saying, but what they mean is it can't be misdiagnosed, it's medically impossible, stuff like that. That's what they mean, whereas they're implying other stuff like cancers, like it does not fulfill that criteria. So that's what's implicit there. But do we want to take a handful? Do we have any questions or like super chats or anything?
Yeah, if people want to ask questions in the chat, they can ask.
Okay.
Otherwise,
and make sure they're not all from Doug. Not that I don't want to take questions from Doug, but we do. I do want to hear a plurality of voices, and I'm sure I if he does a response to this or something, or wants one of us on the show at some point, like that's fine. But
yeah, this is like we said in the beginning. This is meant to be more of a resource for people. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't know if Tim's gonna come back on.
Well, let's just go ahead and do questions if we have any, and if not, we can just wrap it up. I think we pretty much covered everything.
Let me see. I'm not seeing any questions really. James, any more concluding thoughts or anything like that? Oh, here, actually, we do have a question. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so here's one question: does Caleb believe all the miracles in his book actually occurred? I would assume that the ones that you wrote about, that you affirmed in your book, that you said you affirmed, you do, because otherwise.
I would say that most of the ones, the case studies that I talk about, I would say that most of them have a higher than 50% chance of being miracles. Some of them I do think that I could poke holes if I wanted to. So it depends on which one. I would say that you could make a reasonable case for all of the case studies, but I do have sections about anecdotes, and I don't put much weight in those. And I kind of say, look, I can't verify these anecdotes. The Craig Keener, and I'm not bashing Craig Keener, but just ones of, I know a missionary who said he knows a guy who was paralyzed and healed. That's fine, but I think we need really specific diagnoses, really specific. We need to make sure all those conditions are tacked off. And a lot of times you just can't do that if it's a very vague report. So for the really specific ones that I go into of the case studies, I do think most of those are probably miracles. But I wouldn't affirm that for all of them. And I wouldn't even claim that I could prove all the miracles in the Bible. I think you could maybe retroactively do that, but I wouldn't say like the crossing of the Red Sea or something fits all those criteria. I think that you couldn't make a case historically for those absent Jesus or something. So I would say that.
Cool. Cool. We got Apologetic Squared ask a question. Do you endorse skeptical theism? Does this undercut the divine psychology needed to determine miracles prior? So
this is a good question for Tim, but I think you.
For me at least, I don't endorse skeptical theism. I think there's maybe one or two versions that I'm like sympathetic to, but I just don't think that it's a thesis that we should be endorsing. And I think we should instead be doing defenses and theodicy. I think I would agree with some philosophers out there when they say that a Christian worldview can't really be complete or rational without theodicy. And the reason, one of the main reasons too why I don't endorse it is because of the latter half of the question, where I think that skeptical theism, at least most formulations of the thesis, and undercut, like pretty much pave the way to divine psychology or objections to Bayesian cases. So, and Tim's in here too, so maybe Tim wants to say something.
Well, I'm back. My internet died. That's a problem, but we gotta get back to those. I don't know what's happening. Am I interrupting something? Am I just?
No, I was just answering a question from Apologetic Squared. He just asked, "Do you endorse skeptical theism? Does this undercut?" Yeah, so you gave my answer pretty much. Does this undercut the divine psychology needed to determine a miracles prior?
Yes, it would.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah,
So
we would, and we don't do that. So we
yeah,
don't. Do
I don't think any of us here endorse
Yeah.
skeptical theism. Do you,
And
James?
that's not the only reason why, but I
Yeah.
think that.
I'm sympathetic with the idea behind it, but I'm not gonna straight up say I full scale endorse it.
I think that when one says, I'm not calling James out, but I think when one says that, they're probably saying that I like epistemic humility when we're talking about the problem of evil. But I think that skeptical theism is a very specific set of claims that I think are pretty radical. So the number of people who are actually skeptical theists, I think many people think that they're skeptical theists when they're actually not. That's something I would say. But yeah. Can we go back to this? I'm sorry. Can we go back to the slide with the criteria on it? I'm sorry. Blame Spectrum Wi-Fi.
Yes, give me a second. Also, I will just say for Pine Creek, who is saying that these examples that I gave are terrible, you need to give could you give an argument for why they don't fulfill that instead of just because
we'll talk later.
I can just say, well, your statement is terrible, but I'm not trying to do that here. But I'm just saying, like, can we give reasons for why they aren't instead of just asserting that they are terrible? Because I don't think that's much of an argument. That's all I'll say.
Oh, I hope I remember my points.
Whoever said that I have a big Habermas energy, I don't know how to.
Yeah, I laughed at that one. That was like, you know us? Like, what?
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that, but thank you. Oh wait, what? That's not the right button. I'm sorry. I can't talk and click at the same time apparently. Share screen. We're doing this all for you, Tim. You leave us.
Again, Spectrum Wi-Fi. Lay it at the feet of them.
There you go. It's funny because this was sponsored by Spec. No, it wasn't. Spectrum, if you're watching and you want to sponsor Than's channel, I'm sure he'll be willing to do a plug. Okay, there you go.
Okay, so I've got these criteria are okay, but like I don't think that these are the best. I mean, in terms of criteria that people have come up with, like, yeah, I don't know about this. So like the first one, the miracle is pre-announced. I think that can help sort of establish a context and sort of take away some of the worries about it just being this sort of arbitrary event. But also, I mean, I think that there are potentially problems. Like I think that the fact that it looks like Jesus predicted his death and resurrection, I think that actually is a problem. It is a problem more than it helps for resurrection apologetics, for example. So if this miracle is sort of pre-announced, that can sort of charge the context in a way that is actually bad for the veracity.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. Like Fatima the miracle of Fatima is a good example because you have these kids saying,
Marian apparitions for sure.
Expect to see a miracle in the sky at this time, and everyone goes there and they say, look at the sky, look at, and people stare there and like, oh, wait a minute, this clouds do look different.
Yeah.
And so it's like, wouldn't they be expecting to see that? And so their minds are
that charges the expectations in a way that
whereas if people just saw this around the world independently without knowing the context, that would be more like, oh, okay, they're clearly don't have that in mind. Like that's more interesting. So it falsifies it, but it can hurt it depending on the context.
The second and fourth, I think, are fine if we're talking about the things, and I think if we're being charitable and in various ways, I think that the second and fourth are fine. With regards to repeatability, I think I've got two things. One is I think there's problems with viewing miracles as these repeatable events. Both on an ethical level, I don't think that the purpose of miracles is to sort of satiate one's personal epistemic standards for doing this. I think that here it would appeal to like Paul Moser's religious epistemology, for those who are familiar there. And I'm not going to get into a big long thing anymore on that. But secondly, could we suggest sort of an amendment to that as in a way that sort of it can include the Christian miracles as repeatable in the sense that there are a lot of these claims. There are a lot of these claims that are similarly evidentially made, and they seem to happen under specific types of conditions, narratively and with regards to specific scenarios. So I think that we could probably say that they're repeatable in some sense, not repeatable in some super rigorous sense, but I think that repeatable in the relevant sense to sort of account for to sort of what is the word to sort of guard against the evidential barriers that Doug is trying to guard against when he's making this claim. So I think that we could probably amend the repeatability claim to make it fine, and include the Christian miracles.
Anything else?
That's all I had.
All right. I'm trying to see if there were other questions that I missed.
No,
I'm
I
sure
think-
there were a lot of good ones.
maybe, I don't know. A lot of it just
I
looks
don't
like
know.
bickering back and forth, which is
Yeah, I don't know about the guys. You gotta do better with these chats, man. You gotta yeah, I'm calling this audience.
None of my moderators are on right now. That's why I've been a little distracted.
It's the mod's fault.
I've taken a brief look, and it's like, ooh, man, this is. I've seen better.
It'll be fun. I think this is. I don't know what your normal watch rate is. I feel like this is a pretty good turnout.
Yeah,
How many people are watching?
About 50.
we're at about 50. Wait,
Pretty hostile audience, I think.
What did you expect, Tim? You thought that?
Wait,
Yeah, I
Pine
mean-
Creek asked a question, but I'm having trouble interpreting what the question is.
That's what I was about to bring up. Yeah.
Okay. So he says, let's
Yeah.
pretend Jesus didn't rise from the dead, yet we have the New Testament exactly as we see it today. Can you guys give an explanation?
Sure.
Can you help me understand what the question exactly
He's trying to say that if that we have all the data that we've got,
Okay.
basically, I think. And he says, but we have this other independent reason to think that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that is like sort of swamps whatever other evidence that we have for the resurrection. And so we can confidently say epistemically that Jesus did not rise from the dead. Can you offer a legitimate alternative explanation for the data?
Could you have the New Testament if Jesus didn't rise from the dead? Could you have the New Testament as we have it?
Oh,
if Jesus
okay.
didn't rise from the dead?
Could we have all? Could
Would
the
a
evidence
better way
look
of it, like-
exactly the same? Could the evidence look exactly the same, but Jesus didn't rise from the dead? Okay.
Oh, okay. So the way I
Can
was
you get a
interpreting
yes or no
this-
on that, Douglas?
Okay, because the other way I was interpreting this was like, what is the best competing explanation of the data?
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay, cool.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Can
So
we get a yes or no on that,
You
please?
confirm that that's the question, and then
Yeah. Anything else?
He said he's going to see Lion King, so he might not still be here.
yeah.
but-
So if he doesn't
so,
if he doesn't respond, we can go back to the question. We'll just give him a second.
I think that's a Tim question because Tim is big into his predictive power of New Testament evidence.
All right. Apologetic Squared says, question for everybody, pretty much. What's everyone's credences in Christianity between 0 and 1? That's always like a really hard question to answer.
Do you just want to go around?
Yeah, go ahead. Go around.
I'll say 8.23 out of 10.
You mean 0.823?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, 0 and 1. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. What?
0.823. Yes. 82.3%. Yeah.
Okay. Tim?
On the order of 99%.
Really? Okay.
I would
That's
probably
just the resurrection evidence. I think that encapsulates a lot. But yeah, I'm it's not something that seriously, yeah, Christianity is true. I live that way, so.
Okay.
I would give it also a really high credence. Like on the lower end of my scale would probably be like 0.95, but it's probably higher than that. Like
it's hard to tell between like 95 and 99. You can tell between like a high 99 and a low 99 far easier than you can like 95 and 99. So that's why
I'll be epistemically humble and I'll say 0.95 instead of 0.99, unlike Tim here.
Okay, so
the radical is always.
It ranges for me. Like there's I'm just being honest, right? Like I think there's days where I'm at like low to mid 80s, and then there's days where I'm like Tim, where I'm like close to the 99, but it floats a lot as I just consider data consistently.
Yeah.
So.
That's why
I do is give a range.
I've gotten really good. I think that Trent Dory's really good advice is to like just keep with you like your calculations basically, and just show that while our sort of moods can shift in this way, once you start plugging in the data, I think then one has a pretty good idea of where their credence is. That's for everybody. So I think that just have that sort of that guide to where you're going instead of it just being sort of based on one's mood. But yeah, there.
Let's see. That's a good question. So if pre-announcing a miracle can be a problem for its appearance of veracity, how do you think the Old Testament prophecies affect the appearance of likelihood that of a Messiah being is divine?
That's a really good question. I also thought his name was Justin Martyr for a second. And impressed.
Justin Martyr, that's good.
So I personally don't like the argument from prophecy for the exact reason. I'm going to get pushed back from some people. If Kelton was on here, he would disagree with me. But I don't like that argument for that exact reason. Because I think either a prophecy is so specific where someone could intentionally try to fulfill it, or it's so vague where it can be reinterpreted. That being said, I do think there's at least one or two that would be very hard to do, that could be legitimate in terms of there's the Isaiah, I forget the chapter verse that talks about, Judaism basically spreading through the whole world and all this like messiahship, and Christianity is the only religion that's had as worldwide an influence as that. So it's not impossible that could happen without God, but that does seem to be a legit prophecy that was written before, that's not ambiguous, and that wasn't intentionally fulfilled, or couldn't be intentionally fulfilled by just a small group of people. So that's maybe the best one I can think of in terms of prophecy and preempting kind of things in advance.
The prophecy move is not a strong one that I would make. I would make a much more modest sort of typological, sort of narratively driven case about the Exodus and exile and things like that, where I think the narratively views make sense. But I wouldn't make like a traditional messianic prophecy argument. But I think he was asking like, how do you think that the Old Testament prophecies affect the appearance of the appearance that the Messiah is divine? So is he saying that because it seems like the Old Testament might say that the Messiah would be divine, that would see? I don't know. I'm not exactly sure.
I think the idea is because you mentioned earlier about because sometimes it's argued that if I say, hey, I'm going to perform this miracle, like Jesus says, hey, I'm going to be raised from the dead, that in a sense is kind of preparing his disciples for thinking that he rises from the dead. So maybe that takes away, or maybe it leads to
that I think, that would be a problem. I don't necessarily see that applying with regards to this, because I don't think that it's very clear that the Messiah is going to be divine.
Yeah, I think that's the idea he's going for. Like, can't we take that type of reasoning and apply it to the Old
Testament? Yeah, you'd have to do a lot of work there. I'm not seeing it initially.
I mean, my thoughts on. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, you go ahead. I don't have anything more than that.
So, I mean, my thoughts here is I actually don't think pre-announcing a miracle presents a whole lot of problems for its veracity. Like, I'm not super persuaded by that. But let's suppose I did. I don't think it would be a huge issue with Old Testament prophecy. Because if we look at the Jewish kind of ideas about messiahship in Jesus's time, and we ask, okay, based on their readings of the Old Testament, were they looking for a guy like Jesus? I think the answer to that is overwhelmingly no, and that is borne out in the fact that they kill him, right? So I think if you try to create an argument that Old Testament prophecies created kind of a cultural expectation of a figure that looks like Jesus, and that's an explanation for that, I would just be like, well, most of the Jews
empirically, I mean, that's empirically false, right? Like that's just, they were not expecting this type of thing.
I'm trying to find Doug's question from earlier that we were.
Did you see the one that I just said?
Yeah, I wanted to answer that too.
That's a good one.
I'm trying to find Doug's question that we were trying to figure out how to interpret, but it's not in the chat anymore.
Oh, I remember it. If I just give me a second, I can remember it.
I remember what it was.
Well, yeah, it was if we had the New Testament.
Alternative theory.
If we had the New Testament,
all the data we have.
I think that we interpreted it properly. It was more out of courtesy where I was asking for clarity, but I think that
it's basically a Bayesian question. Would the evidence look the same had this not occurred?
No, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I don't think that we would have the New Testament as we had it. And if we did have, I see. That's
you would want to know what what's specifically about the New Testament.
Can I try to give his argument? I don't know what it is, but I think the idea is like, okay, let's suppose for a second that Jesus didn't rise from the dead.
Yeah.
And then let's suppose for a second that we still have all the New Testament the way it is. Can you provide just any type of explanation?
Yeah.
Is it inexplicable? Right. Or can you provide an explanation? And now I don't want to put words into his mouth or anything, but maybe there's this idea there of okay, so you can explain this, data without Jesus having rose from the dead. Maybe there's this kind of underlying idea of then why should we, if it can be explained without Jesus rising from the dead, why should we then have that part as part of an explanation? And I think the knee-jerk thing I thought I was well, just because we can come up with an explanation doesn't mean it's the best explanation. Yeah,
exactly. It's a good one. I mean, just that's just like saying, well, I can tell a coherent story, and I don't know. I mean, can we tell a coherent story of all this happening if Jesus didn't rise from the dead? I don't. Maybe.
I think you would also try to ask. Okay, we would agree. Could you explain the Quran being written without Muhammad receiving revelation from God? Do you think that could happen as we have it without?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's what he's asking. Okay, could we have the same evidence for could we have the New Testament as written with all the evidence that you consider without Jesus having written?
I think coherently you could, but I just don't think that just because you can tell a story doesn't mean that the likelihood ratio in favor of the resurrection hypothesis, that doesn't mean that's.
And it would depend on what evidence you think there is. If you're doing just like a minimalist Paul thing, I think you could. But if you're doing
if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I think that the New Testament evidence is very surprising. So if this was an unsettled question, then but if I was somehow forced to say you have this, and then you have to come up with this explanation, that for some reason the resurrection is ruled out, like I literally am standing here with like God saying, nope, Jesus didn't rise from the dead, you have to pick another theory.
Yeah. If you think that the New Testament was, if you think the gospel was written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses, and that they were reporting facts accurately, and that they were persecuted, and that they reported seeing Jesus eating with him, all this stuff, and they could be mistaken. If you thought that was the evidence that we had, and I know that's contested. Yeah. If that's what the evidence you thought we had, I don't think I could reasonably make sense of that if they weren't telling the truth at that point. But if you think that these are far removed, that are anonymous texts that are not derived from that, then I think that you could explain this to like that.
If the New Testament, if we have this robust New Testament with this good reason that these things happen, then I don't think that
so it depends on what
these people were actually eating and touching Jesus. It
depends on what he's willing to grant.
They were eating with and touching Jesus, stuff like that, and multiple times and all this, but all the details.
Of course, doesn't grant that, but yes, like
but if we had, I would have. I mean, at that point, I would have to say these people were lying, and they they died for some reason. But even that, it's just like maybe, but like I just don't see that.
Yeah,
as a very good explanation.
All right, we'll take 2 more questions, and then if there's anything else that we,
you
guys see something you want to add, if you see something you want to answer, let me know. But here's 2 other ones. So here's a question: could defeaters be present for non-resurrection doctrine that would undermine your credence? Genesis authorship, Adam and Eve versus genetics, Jonah as pure fiction. You guys get the point.
Caleb, go first. You're the most. You're the lib.
The Old Testament stuff doesn't really bother me because I think you could argue, some may argue this, whether or not I have is you could argue that Jesus is referencing these not as historical, but just because he has a Jewish audience and that's who he's talking to, and that maybe he himself didn't think this. I'm not saying that's what is. It's possible. That you could be like a Rand Rouser Christian, but I think a bigger defeater would be if you thought, for example, that Jesus falsely predicted his second coming. If you thought that he was a apocalyptic prophet, that would significantly hurt the priors. And people not many skeptics have attempted that, and I think that's a shame on their part. I think if I was going to play devil's advocate and put ideas in people's heads, I think that's the route you need to go. That's the throat you need to slit in that case. That's the killer move you need to go for, because that would. Why wouldn't it completely destroy the evidence? It would certainly really hurt the priors of Jesus being in that special category if he's errant and makes false prophecies from time to time. So that for me would be a pretty strong indicator that might be a partial defeater. So that's what I would say.
I agree. I think that you could if it doesn't look like God is at all active in the story of Israel, I don't think that would make much sense of Jesus' mission, and thus I think that would really hurt the priors. I don't think that we need to be like fundamentalists. I don't think we need to say that we have to take a young Earth creationist reading of Genesis 1 or something like that. But I think that if, for example, Moses never existed or something like that, then I think that would significantly hurt the priors for Christianity.
Do you guys think there's anything like that would cause your credence to drop under 0.5?
Well,
like for me, it wouldn't. Like even if I had like a lot of defeaters.
I mean, I would be. I think it would. If we really, it wouldn't just be the Moses, but it would be like, I don't know. I think one could probably sell me a scenario in which Jesus is just completely.
Yeah, Tim, you need to watch more Andy Stanley sermons and unhitch Jesus from the Old Testament.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a way you could run that argument that I would find probably maybe I'm not.
When it comes to Old Testament violence, he will yank that chain supervised. Oh yeah, I'm sure we can throw that out, but not when it comes to Moses and other people. I'm just being facetious, Tim.
For example, if we thought that God really did that, then we're screwed. So yeah.
All right.
See, that's gonna be a soundbite now, but he's just gonna take that.
Good. They need to hear it.
Cut to music. Yeah, there you go.
All right. So another question. Major Knight Wizard says, "Why can't we just bite the bullet and accept the Flying Man symmetry breaker? The issue is with no symmetrical evidence. Isn't this thought experiment close to meaningless?" And we kind of touched on this in the stream, but if you get somebody wants to,
it becomes redundant, and then we're talking about something else with that. We're talking about the epistemology of testimony or something like that. But yeah, we've gone beyond the Flying Man at that point, and he's off and running with his traditional objections to Christianity, and we're sort of beyond the Flying Man. But I think it's still important as an outsider test, because if you don't have this sort of attachment, are you really, is this evidence really strong? And he's trying to catch Christians in an inconsistency there somewhere. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of covered that, and I would agree with just what you said, Tim. Do you guys have any other questions we want to answer here before we kind of sign off for the night? No.
Well, thanks everyone for having a lively listening session to this and listening to our comments, and thanks for inviting me, Than and Caleb, and it was a lot of fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, guys.
Well, on to the next one. We're gonna be doing other ones too, right?
Yeah, Pine Creek. If you ever see this, we get to the end of this. I think some of us are planning on doing a response to Poof or Drown and some other stuff. So stay tuned.
There's Andrew.
Yeah, there you go. Hi, Andrew. Andrew was on Cameron's channel for everyone watching.
Yeah.
He did the recent universalism stream, so check that out.
Yep. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for watching. Until next time.